What happens when those trained to heal become casualties of war themselves? Spring 1945. Somewhere along the collapsing Western Front in Germany, the Third Reich's final days were written not only in defeat, but in the exhausted faces of medical workers. Among retreating German forces were women in blood-stained Red Cross uniforms, nurses who worked without rest, without supplies, and without hope. When they finally met American troops, their words shocked even battle-hardened GIs. "Please end our suffering." It was not a plea for mercy or help, but something far more devastating. A request born from starvation, exhaustion, and months of witnessing death on an industrial scale beyond human comprehension. What the American soldiers did next would challenge everything these German nurses had been taught to believe about their enemy. By April 1945, the Wehrmacht was disintegrating, but behind retreating units followed a forgotten force. Germany's massive medical infrastructure collapsed under impossible strain. Field hospitals built for hundreds held thousands. Medical trains sat abandoned on bombed rail lines. Nurses trained to heal now struggled simply to survive. Most were young women, barely 20, recruited from civilian hospitals or pressured to volunteer. They were not fanatics. They came from villages and cities, dreaming of nursing careers that war had violently stolen from them. By April, they marched westward in groups of 30 or more. Their white uniforms were grey with dirt, stained with blood that would not wash out. Red Cross armbands faded, neutrality barely visible anymore. The strategic situation was catastrophic. American forces pushed from the west, British and Canadians from the north, Soviets from the east. Germany was being torn apart, and its medical units ordered to retreat into chaos. The nurses' ordeal began weeks earlier when American armor broke through the Ruhr Valley. Oberfeldschwester Gertrude Hoffmann recorded orders to evacuate 370 wounded with 12 trucks, half without fuel. What followed was a forced march lasting nearly 3 weeks. Nurses carried bandages in pockets, morphine hidden in uniforms, instruments wrapped in cloth. It was never enough, yet every abandoned wounded soldier begged them to stop. Every few kilometers they found more wounded soldiers left behind in ditches and farmhouses. Nurse Anna Klee, just 22, later said they could not turn away, even when they had nothing left to give. They cleaned wounds with stream water, shared bread until it was gone, and watched men die who could have lived with basic supplies. By April 10th, Hoffmann's unit had shrunk as nurses collapsed or vanished. Some were lost during air attacks. Others were left with local families too weak to continue. 43 women pressed on, avoiding highways controlled by American armor, moving only along muddy country roads. Cold April rain turned paths into sludge. Boots fell apart, cardboard stuffed into soles to cover holes. Feet bled, blisters burst and infected, yet stopping meant capture or death, so they kept walking. Hunger consumed every thought. They had not eaten properly in 8 days. They survived on raw turnips, rotten apples, and once, meat cut from a dead horse already scavenged by others. One nurse recalled that after the 5th day, the stomach pain stopped. That was worse. Bodies were shutting down. Younger girls spoke only of food, of mothers cooking meals from a world that no longer existed. By April 18th, they heard American artillery, its sound different from German guns. Each day it grew closer. On the 19th, they passed a town flattened completely by Allied bombing. In the ruins stood a makeshift aid station. 5 wounded soldiers and 1 medic remained, out of morphine and hope. He warned them the Americans were less than 10 kilometers away. Hoffmann faced an impossible choice. East meant Soviets, north meant British. She chose west. The Americans, she told the nurses, might follow the Geneva Convention. None knew what awaited them. Nazi propaganda had painted the Allies as monsters, especially toward women. Some feared execution, others whispered of camps. Still, they marched on, too exhausted to be afraid anymore. On April 20th, Hitler's birthday, they met their fate near a village southwest of Bad Hersfeld. They had spent the night in a barn, watching American vehicles roll past in the darkness. At dawn, engines stopped. English voices carried through the air. Nurse Hoffman stepped forward, but when she opened the barn door, American soldiers already surrounded them, rifles raised. Slowly, Hoffman lifted her hands and spoke in broken English. They were nurses, Red Cross. They surrendered. For a long moment, no one moved, the silence heavy with fear. Sergeant Thomas Martinez later wrote he thought it was a trick. Then he saw their faces. He had seen battle, death and ruin, but never people who looked so completely broken. The nurses emerged, hands raised. Some cried. Others stared at the ground. Several trembled from hunger and exhaustion. Then a young nurse, barely 19, whispered words that stunned everyone. "Please end our suffering." She was not asking for mercy. She wanted the march, the hunger, the fear to be over. Another nurse fell to her knees, repeating a single word. "Bitter." Martinez lowered his rifle. He called for his medic. Corporal James Wright stepped forward, hands open, Red Cross armband visible, and gently asked if anyone was wounded. The question confused them, no shouting, no threats, just concern. One by one, American soldiers lowered their weapons, realizing they were facing not enemies, but starving women. Martinez radioed headquarters. 40-plus German medical personnel, female, in critical condition. Immediate evacuation requested. Still, the nurses feared punishment, clinging to each other. Then an American soldier offered water. The nurse hesitated until Hoffman nodded. She drank clean, cold water and began to cry, unable to understand what was happening. More American vehicles arrived within minutes. A medical jeep stopped and Captain Robert Sullivan jumped out. One look at the nurses and he began issuing orders without hesitation. Get them to the aid station. Find food, nothing heavy, soup, bread, water. Their bodies couldn't handle more. The nurses listened, stunned, expecting cruelty instead of care. Loaded into trucks, they waited for anger or interrogation. Instead, soldiers asked if they were cold or injured. One nurse whispered to Hoffman, asking why the enemy was being kind. The aid station was a commandeered school. Inside were clean beds, blankets, and tables stacked with medical supplies these women hadn't seen in months, organized and abundant. Fresh bandages, sterile instruments, bottles of penicillin and morphine untouched. Nurse Clee froze in the doorway, convinced she was hallucinating after weeks of exhaustion. An American nurse, Lieutenant Mary O'Connor, spoke gently and told her she was safe. The word felt unreal. Safe was something from another lifetime. Doctors examined the nurses. Severe malnutrition, infections, exhaustion close to collapse. One doctor asked when they last ate. 8 days, maybe 9. Time no longer made sense. Then came hot stew and real bread. The smell alone made some nurses cry. Yet many refused to eat. Convinced prisoners didn't deserve food. Some hid bread under cots, fearing it would be taken away. Lieutenant O'Connor knelt beside them and said there was more, as much as they needed. Those words shattered them. Nurses sobbed while eating. Others stared through tears, unable to understand relief mixed with guilt and disbelief. One older nurse asked why they were treated this way. Captain Sullivan answered simply, they were nurses. Caring for wounded soldiers was not a crime. It was their duty as medical personnel. "But we are German," she insisted. Sullivan replied that they were human beings first. Over the next 3 days, the nurses regained strength, sleeping without fear for the first time in weeks. American medics were surprised by their skill. Despite chaos and shortages, these women had performed surgeries under fire and improvised treatments when supplies vanished. The nurses, in turn, were stunned by American abundance. Used syringes were discarded, not boiled. "We have more," an American doctor said. "We had nothing," one nurse whispered. On April 26th, they were transferred to a larger processing center. Unlike combat prisoners, they were housed in a former hospital with sanitation, food, and continued medical care. Interviews followed, not interrogations. Most were classified as non-combatants and released within weeks. Papers were issued, allowing them to search for surviving family members. Hoffman returned home to ruins. Her parents were dead. Her brother missing on the Eastern Front. Nurse Klee resumed civilian nursing, serving patients for decades after the war. Nurse Schneider emigrated to the United States, married a former GI, and kept a small American flag as a tribute to mercy shown when she expected none. Not all healed. Some carried invisible wounds for life, haunted by what they had witnessed and the regime they had unknowingly served. But in a barn that April morning, 43 women learned that even in war's darkest hours, compassion could still exist. But to the nurses, starving and terrified, that kindness changed everything. Years later, one wrote that it restored her belief in humanity when she had lost all hope. Margaret, the older nurse from Munich, later sent a letter to the 1st Infantry Division's veterans. She thanked them for food, water and dignity when they had none left. The Geneva Convention required humane treatment of medical personnel. What happened that morning went beyond obligation. It was a choice made by exhausted men to see people, not enemies. In the vast history of World War II, this moment is barely remembered. No medals were awarded. No official records celebrated it. Yet for 43 German nurses who begged for their suffering to end, it became the defining moment of their lives. This was not a story of victory or strategy. It was a story of compassion in a war defined by cruelty and loss. It reminds us that humanity can survive even where hatred is strongest, and that small acts can carry enormous meaning. History is filled with forgotten moments like this. Quiet decisions that never made headlines, yet changed lives forever. Because sometimes the most powerful stories of war are not about battles, but about mercy and the courage to remain human.